Welcome to this week's episode of This Week in Diaspora History on the Jewish Diaspora Report. Let's get started. Welcome to this week's episode of This Week in Diaspora History on the Jewish Diaspora Report. Let's get started. Third of Tammuz, 1656, London, England. Rabbi Menashe ben Israel petitioned for permission to practice Judaism in England. The permission was granted by the Council of the State. In 1290, King Edward I of England had issued an edict expelling all Jews from England. However, the English Reformation, which started in the 1530s, brought a number of changes that benefited Jews in the long term. After both the Alhambra decree, which expelled all Jews from Spain in 1492, and similar measures in Portugal in 1496, some converso traders, Jews who converted to Christianity, but often still practiced Judaism in secret, settled in London and Bristol. The small community in London was largely linked by trade to the city of Antwerp. It was because of London's growing importance as a trading city that the Jews from the Netherlands began to settle in the country. There was also a great increase of religious freedom and religious diversity in England under Oliver Cromwell. A petition for a readmission of the Jews to England was submitted by Johanna and Ebenezer Cartwright, two English Baptists living in Amsterdam in 1649. However, the petition was sent the day before the High Court was established to try Charles I. So in the ensuing turmoil, the Cartwrights never received an answer. The following year, the Amsterdam-based rabbi and diplomat Menashe ben Israel wrote in his book, Hope of Israel, that it was a necessity for the Jews to be, quote, spread out to the ends of the earth before they could be redeemed. In 1651, Ben Israel met with leading English figures on the mission to secure an Anglo-Dutch coalition. The English were impressed by the learning and the manner and advised him to formally apply for Jewish readmission to England. In 1653, Cromwell issued the official directive to authorize Menashe ben Israel, a rabbi of the Jewish nation, to come from Amsterdam to these parts. Fearing local anti-English opinion so soon after the war, Ben Israel turned down the invitation from the English. Competition with the Dutch for trade made Oliver Cromwell want to attract the rich Jews of Amsterdam to London, so that they may transfer their important trade interests with the Spanish Main from the Netherlands to England. Menashe ben Israel's son Samuel had arrived in England in 1653 to investigate the possibility of the resettlement of the Jews. The rabbi himself came to England in September 1655 with three other local rabbis, where they were lodged as guests of Cromwell. This began the eventual settlement of Jews in the land of England. Also 3rd of Tammuz, 1871, Cincinnati, Ohio. Rabbi Bernard Ilawi, a staunch opponent of the Reform movement, passes away. Ilawi was the first Orthodox rabbi with a PhD to come from Europe and settle in the United States. Rabbi Dr. Bernard Ilawi was born in 1841 in Kolin, Bohemia. Ilawi descended from a family of religious scholars. His great-grandfather Jacob Ilawi was the rabbi of Kolin. Ilawi studied in his native city where he received rabbinic ordination. Subsequently, Ilawi received a PhD from the University of Budapest, continued his studies at the Rabbinical College in Padua, Italy. Known for his oratory ability, he was reportedly an accomplished linguist, and besides a thorough knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, he spoke also fluent German, English, French, and Italian. Ilawi was unable to secure a position in the rabbinate in Europe due to his opposition to the Habsburg Empire. He was suspected of sympathizing with the local revolutionaries during the upheavals of 1848. He therefore emigrated to the United States, where he had an easier time being hired as a rabbi. Throughout his rabbinical career, he was a rabbi in New York City, Syracuse, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, New Orleans, and finally Cincinnati, where he retired. Throughout his tenure in the United States, he was an ardent opponent of the spread of Reform Judaism, eloquently and to an extent successfully challenging the movement's religious innovations and leadership in the press in the United States and Germany. Ilawi wanted to strengthen traditional Torah law observance in the United States. Rabbi Ilawi mastered halakha and became renowned throughout the United States, and religious questions were posed to him from across America. Some of these decisions were published in the press in New York and Philadelphia. In 1854, Alawi became the first rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregation in St. Louis, at the time an Orthodox congregation. That same year, he started St. Louis's first Hebrew school. He resigned after 1 year of service due to his, quote, philosophical differences with the congregation. Alawi continued to express his opposition to the Reform movement from his last pulpit in Cincinnati, ironically the base of the Reform movement. His pleas, as eloquent as they may have been, were unable to affect the actions of everyday lives of the growing Jewish communities throughout the United States. Congregations requiring rabbinic guidance tended to be more open to the liberal interpretations and innovations of the Reform movement. Many congregations founded as Orthodox synagogues scattered through the United States joined the Union of American Hebrew Congregations throughout his life and after his death. Also 3rd of Tammuz, 1994, Manhattan, New York. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, the spiritual leader of the Chabad movement, passes away. Menachem Mendel Schneerson, known to many as the Lubavitcher Rebbe or simply the Rebbe, was a Russian Empire-born American Orthodox rabbi and the most recent Rebbe of the Lubavitch Hasidic dynasty. He is considered one of the most influential Jewish leaders of the 20th century. Menachem Mendel Schneerson was born April 5, 1902, in the Black Sea port of Nikolaev in the Russian Empire. In 1950, after the death of the previous Rebbe, Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson, Menachem Mendel's father-in-law, Chabad followers began persuading Menachem Mendel to succeed his father-in-law as the new Rebbe. Schneerson was reluctant and actively refused to accept the leadership of the movement. He continued, however, all of the communal activities that he had previously headed. It would take a full year until he was persuaded by the elders of the movement to accept the post. On the first anniversary of his father-in-law's passing, in the ceremony attended by several hundred rabbis and Jewish leaders from all parts of the United States and Canada, Schneerson delivered a Hasidic discourse and formally became the Rebbe. As Rebbe, Schneerson would receive visitors for private meetings. These meetings would begin at 8 p.m. and often continue until 5 or 6 in the morning, and were open to everybody. Schneerson, who spoke several languages including English, Yiddish, Hebrew, French, Russian, German, and Italian, would converse with people on all issues and offer his advice on both spiritual and mundane matters. Politicians and leaders from Israel and across the globe came to meet with him, but Schneerson showed no preference to one person over another. His secretary reportedly once even declined to admit John F. Kennedy because Schneerson was already meeting with people who had requested appointments months earlier. Almost immediately after taking control of the Chabad movement, Schneerson established a Chabad woman and girls organization and a youth organization in Israel. Their mission was to engage in outreach, which was exclusively directed at women and teens. In 1953, he opened branches of these organizations in New York, London, and Toronto. In a departure from the entrenched tendency to limit high-level Torah education to men and boys, Schneerson equally addressed his teachings to both genders. He addressed meetings of the organizations and led gatherings exclusively for women. Schneerson would describe the increase in Torah study by women as one of the, quote, positive innovations of the later generations. In 1983, Schneerson launched a global campaign to promote awareness of the Supreme Being and observance of the Noahide laws among all people. He argued that this was the basis for human rights in all civilization. Schneerson initiated Jewish outreach in the post-Holocaust era. He believed that the world Jewry was seeking to learn more about its heritage and sought to bring Judaism to Jews wherever they were. British Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks said of the Rebbe, quote, that if the Nazis searched out every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wished to search out every Jew in love. He oversaw the building of schools, community centers, and youth camps and created a global network of emissaries. In 1977, Schneerson suffered a heart attack, which he survived. This was followed by suffering a serious stroke 15 years later while praying at the grave of his father-in-law. The stroke left him unable to speak and paralyzed on the right side of his body. On the morning of the 3rd of Tammuz, Schneerson died at a New York hospital and was buried at the Ohel next to his father-in-law, Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson, in Queens, New York. The indelible mark that the Rebbe made on Jews and Judaism across the world cannot truly be described. This has been another episode of This Week in Diaspora History on the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check out our other